I am Camille, 33 years old, and my husband paraded his 24-year-old mistress right through the front door of the estate I secretly paid for. Instead of throwing them out, my entire in-law family welcomed her with open arms and demanded I set an extra plate. I simply smiled and poured myself a glass of wine. 30 days later, I moved $8.5 million to Switzerland and left them with exactly $14.32. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever smiled in the face of absolute betrayal while plotting your perfect financial revenge. The scent of slow braised short ribs and candied yams filled the massive gourmet kitchen of our Buckhead estate. It was precisely 5 in the evening on a Sunday. In my husband Terrence's family, Sunday dinner was an institution. It was a weekly performance of perfection, wealth, and faith, orchestrated entirely by my mother-in-law Brenda. I stood at the sprawling marble island, carefully arranging crystal goblets and wiping imaginary smudges from the expensive silverware. Brenda sat at the head of the dining table in her Sunday best, an immaculate emerald green suit she had worn to morning service. She watched me with the usual barely concealed disdain she reserved for the woman she believed was living off her successful son. Terrence was a sports agent, a man whose image was everything. To the outside world and certainly to his mother, he was a kingmaker, negotiating multi-million-dollar contracts and bringing home wealth that justified his arrogant swagger. I was just Camille, the quiet wife with a boring corporate desk job in mergers and acquisitions. They thought my salary barely covered my own shoe collection. They had no idea that my desk job was the only thing keeping this family from total financial ruin. They did not know about the blind trusts, the offshore accounts, or the fact that the very marble floor Brenda was tapping her designer heel against belonged to an LLC that I entirely controlled. I let them believe the lie because it kept the peace and because Terrence's fragile ego required him to be the undisputed provider. Then the heavy oak front door swung open. The loud thud echoed through the grand foyer, followed by the sound of Terrence's booming laugh. I wiped my hands on a kitchen towel and stepped out to greet him, expecting him to be alone. Instead, I stopped dead in my tracks. Terrence was walking into our home, his fingers tightly intertwined with the hand of a young woman who looked like she had just stepped off a college campus. She was draped in a fitted designer dress and carrying a limited edition handbag. I recognized that handbag immediately. It cost $6,000, and I had personally approved the expense on Terrence's corporate card 3 weeks ago when he claimed he needed to purchase a high-end gift for a client's wife. My heart slammed against my ribs in a sudden violent drumbeat of shock. I expected the room to erupt. I expected Brenda to stand up and start screaming scripture. I expected Terrence's father, Calvin, who was watching football in the adjacent den, to march over and demand an explanation. I braced myself for the chaotic, furious implosion of my 10-year relationship, but the explosion never came. Instead of outrage, a horrifying, sickening calm washed over the house. Brenda stood up from the dining table, smoothing her emerald skirt. She walked right past me, her expensive perfume masking the scent of the dinner I had cooked for her. She extended her arms and wrapped the young woman in a warm, familiar embrace. "It is so good to finally have you over," Kiara, Brenda cooed, kissing the girl on both cheeks, as if she were a long-lost niece. "You are just as gorgeous in person as you are in those pictures Terrence showed me." Calvin strolled out of the den, turning off the television. He gave Terrence a firm pat on the back, a gesture of deep masculine solidarity, and offered Kiara a welcoming nod. "Welcome to the family dinner, sweetheart," he said, his voice thick with southern hospitality. "We have been looking forward to this." I stood frozen by the kitchen archway, my mind struggling to process the surreal nightmare playing out in my own foyer. This was not a surprise to them. This was an ambush. They all knew. They had known for weeks, maybe months. My entire in-law family had conspired with my husband to bring his mistress into my home under my roof and replace me right in front of my face. The betrayal was so absolute, so flawlessly coordinated, that it temporarily took my breath away. Kiara smiled brightly, her excessive lip gloss catching the light from the crystal chandelier. "Thank you so much for having me, Mrs. Brenda," she chimed, her voice breathless and naive. "Terrence talks about your cooking all the time." Brenda beamed, completely ignoring the fact that I had been the one slaving over the stove all afternoon. She turned her head and looked directly at me. Her expression was completely devoid of empathy or guilt. It was the look of a woman who was reclaiming her son from a wife she never deemed worthy. "Camille, baby," Brenda said, her tone dripping with a venomous, sweet condescension. "Do not just stand there hovering like a stranger. Go into the kitchen and set an extra plate for Terrence's guest. We do not want the food getting cold." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of her command rang in my ears. A lesser woman would have screamed. A weaker woman would have thrown the crystal goblets against the wall, packed a bag in tears, and fled into the night, giving them exactly the dramatic, hysterical reaction they were waiting for. They wanted me to break. They wanted to cast me as the unhinged wife who could not handle the reality of a modern marriage. But I am a mergers and acquisitions specialist. My entire career is built on assessing hostile takeovers, calculating massive risks, and dismantling opponents before they even realize the ink on the contract is dry. When faced with a crisis, I do not cry. I audit. I looked at Terrence. He was standing tall, puffing his chest out, a smug, arrogant grin plastered across his face. He actually believed he had won. He actually believed his family's endorsement protected him from any consequences. He thought the house, the cars, the bank accounts, and the lifestyle were firmly under his control. He thought I was just the quiet, submissive wife who would accept this humiliation to keep a roof over her head. I let out a slow, steady breath. I let the panic dissolve into cold, hard calculation. I looked at Kiara's designer bag, funded by my secret accounts. I looked at Brenda's expensive suit, paid for by the allowance I routed into Terrence's failing business. I looked at the mansion they were standing in, legally owned by a Swiss corporation with my name as the sole beneficiary. I smiled. A warm, pleasant, absolutely terrifying smile that completely unnerved Terrence for a fraction of a second. "Of course, Brenda," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly steady. "I will set a plate right now. Welcome to our home, Kiara." I turned around, walked calmly back to the sprawling marble island, and poured myself a generous glass of Cabernet. I took a slow sip, letting the rich wine coat my throat. They wanted a transition. They wanted to play a high-stakes game of family politics. They had no idea they had just declared war on a woman who owned the board, the pieces, and the bank. The countdown to their absolute financial ruin had just begun. I pulled a fresh china plate from the glass cabinet. The soft clink of porcelain echoed under the hum of their sickeningly cheerful conversation. My hands did not shake. My breathing remained perfectly even. As I carried the extra plate to the sprawling dining table, the reality of their coordinated ambush unfolded around me like a perfectly rehearsed stage play. They had all known. Every single one of them had conspired to bring this girl into my sanctuary, fully expecting me to bow down and accept my new place in the hierarchy. Terrence's younger sister, Monique, bounded into the dining room. She did not offer me a greeting, not even a passing glance. Instead, she made a direct line for the 24-year-old girl standing in my foyer. Monique practically shrieked with delight, grabbing Kiara by the arm. "Girl, is that the new spring collection?" Monique gasped, pointing her manicured finger at the leather handbag draped over Kiara's shoulder. Kiara offered a shy, manufactured giggle, tracing the gold hardware with her fingertips. "Terrence surprised me with it for our 3-month anniversary." Kiara beamed. "He said a queen deserves the best." Monique nodded enthusiastically, casting a sideways smirk in my direction. "Well, my brother always did have expensive taste." I placed the plate down on the mahogany table. 3 months. He had been seeing her for 3 months, and that bag, the one they were currently drooling over, was purchased on his Platinum Express card. The same card I had paid off in full 14 days ago using an untraceable dividend from one of my corporate subsidiary accounts. I bought that bag. I was literally funding my own replacement, and these fools were celebrating it. Calvin. My father-in-law ambled to the head of the table. He settled into his custom leather armchair, swirling a finger of expensive bourbon in his crystal glass. He looked at Terence, then at me, before shaking his head with a heavy, performative sigh. You have to understand how the world works. Camille. Calvin muttered, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, meant to command absolute authority. A man carries the weight of the world on his shoulders. Terence is out there hustling, making million-dollar deals, fighting in the trenches to keep this family living in luxury. When a man comes home, he does not need a wife who is stressed out from her own little desk job. He needs a sanctuary. He needs peace. He needs a woman who knows how to cater to his spirit. His words were supposed to put me in my place. They were supposed to remind me that my corporate career in mergers and acquisitions was just a cute hobby compared to his son's massive sports agency. I smiled, offering a tight, agreeable curve of my lips. Calvin had no idea that his son had not closed a legitimate sports contract in 24 months. Terrence's agency was a rotting carcass of debt propped up entirely by my quiet capital injections. The crowning jewel of this circus was Chelsea, Andre's wife. The only white woman in the room, she drifted into the dining room holding a glass of sparkling water. Chelsea loved to position herself as the enlightened, progressive voice of reason. She walked right up to me and placed a condescending, gentle hand on my shoulder. She looked into my eyes with a practiced look of deep, empathetic pity. Camille, we know this feels sudden, Chelsea murmured, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. But you have to look at this as an opportunity for growth. In modern marriages, we have to practice ethical non-monogamy. It is actually toxic to expect one person to fulfill all of a man's multifaceted needs. Terence loves you, but he just needs a softer energy right now. You are so fiercely independent and corporate, and that is great, but it is deeply emasculating for a high-value man. I looked at Chelsea's hand resting on my shoulder. I looked at the earnest, self-righteous expression on her face. Ethical non-monogamy, a softer energy. I let the absolute insanity of her words wash over me. She was justifying her brother-in-law parading a mistress into my home by weaponizing therapy speak. Andre, Terrence's older brother, chimed in from the corner, his mouth full of the appetizers I had prepared. Chelsea is right, Camille. Do not make a big thing out of this. Terrence is providing for you. You live in a multi-million-dollar house. You drive a luxury car. You just have to share the throne a little bit. It is not like he is kicking you out to the curb. You just need to adjust your mindset. The sheer delusion of this family was staggering. They had convinced themselves that Terence was the king, the provider, the sole architect of their privileged existence. They were so blinded by their own greed and his flashy facade that they never once stopped to ask how the math actually worked. They never questioned how a sports agent with no major roster was paying for private school tuitions, country club memberships, and luxury car leases. They simply took the money, praised the man who handed it to them, and looked down on the woman who actually earned it. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my Cabernet. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to wait for my reaction. I could see the anticipation in their eyes. They were bracing for the tears, the screaming, the desperate begging. They wanted the satisfaction of watching me break so they could comfortably paint me as the crazy, unhinged wife who ruined Sunday dinner. Instead, I placed my wineglass down and smoothed the front of my dress. You know what I said? My voice completely devoid of anger or panic. I think you are all absolutely right. The entire room went dead silent. Terence blinked, his arrogant smirk faltering into an expression of profound confusion. Brenda's eyebrows shot up toward her hairline. Chelsea withdrew her hand from my shoulder, looking at me as if I were a puzzle she suddenly could not solve. I understand now, I continued, keeping my tone light, almost cheerful. A high-value man like Terence absolutely deserves a sanctuary. He deserves soft energy and peace. I have been so wrapped up in my own career that I completely failed to see the bigger picture. Kiara, please come sit down. The short ribs are perfectly tender. I pulled out the chair directly to my right, offering it to the 24-year-old girl who was actively trying to steal my life. Kiara looked at Terence, unsure of what to do. Terence, utterly bewildered by my compliance, gave her a slow nod. She scurried over and sat down, avoiding my eyes entirely. Let us eat, I said, taking my seat and gracefully placing my napkin in my lap. I smiled around the table at the 5 people who had just sealed their own financial death warrants. As I picked up my fork, I felt a deep, radiating sense of calm. They wanted me to share the throne. They wanted me to adjust my mindset. I was going to do exactly that. I was going to adjust my mindset all the way to a secure banking facility in Zurich, and I was going to leave them sitting on a throne made of nothing but debt lies and absolute ruin. The clatter of silverware against fine china became the soundtrack to my supposed surrender. I sat in my plush velvet dining chair, perfectly poised, slicing into my braised short ribs. Across from me, Terence was holding court, basking in the absolute adoration of his family and his new mistress. He had the audacity to feed Kiara a bite of candied yams off his own fork right in front of me. Brenda watched them with a warm, approving smile, as if she were witnessing the blossoming of a beautiful romance rather than the desecration of her son's marriage. Terence, baby Brenda said, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. Tell Kiara about the new athletic complex you are negotiating. I swear the way my son handles business is a direct gift from God. He is building an empire for this family. Terence puffed up his chest, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt. We are finalizing a $20 million facility deal in downtown Atlanta, he lied effortlessly. It takes a lot of late nights and aggressive negotiations. The sports agency business is cutthroat. That is why I need a peaceful home environment to recharge my spirit. He squeezed Kiara's hand. I chewed my food slowly, letting the rich flavors settle on my tongue. I knew the truth about that athletic complex deal. It died 18 months ago because Terrence bounced a $50,000 retainer check. The developers were furious. I had to quietly wire money from my personal savings directly to their legal team just to keep Terrence out of a massive fraud lawsuit. He has not signed a legitimate athlete to his agency in almost 3 years. Speaking of deals, little brother Andre chimed in from the other end of the table. I am going to need you to look at that business proposal I sent over. Your older brother needs a slight capital injection for a new trucking venture. Nothing major, just 50 grand to get the fleet moving. Terrence waved a hand dismissively, playing the role of the generous billionaire. I got you, man. Send the paperwork to my office. We take care of our own. I took a slow sip of my Cabernet. Andre has never owned a truck in his life. The last capital injection he asked for went straight to his underground gambling debts. But Terrence loves playing the savior, and he never checks the account balances. He just assumes his own greatness manifests the wealth. Monique pointed her fork in my direction. How is your little spreadsheet job going, Camille? It must be nice to just push papers around in a cubicle all day, while Terrence carries the real stress of providing for this massive estate. I do not know how he manages all this pressure. It pays the bills, I said mildly, keeping my voice completely devoid of sarcasm. The table erupted in laughter. Calvin threw his head back, his deep chuckle echoing off the high ceilings. Terrence pays the bills, sweetheart. Calvin corrected me, wiping a tear of mirth from his eye. Your cute little desk job just keeps you out of trouble and gives you something to do. Do not get it twisted. This house, this food, this lifestyle, it is all built on the back of my son's hustle. Chelsea took a delicate sip of her sparkling water and leaned forward. It must be so relieving for you, Camille, not having the pressure to be a provider. My yoga instructor says women who try to match masculine financial energy end up aging prematurely and destroying their hormones. You should really embrace your soft girl era now that Kiara is here to share the emotional load. Your little corporate job is cute, but Terrence is building a legacy. We just want you to be healthy. A cute little desk job. I am the Senior Vice President of Mergers and Acquisitions at one of the top 5 investment firms in the country. I orchestrated a $2 billion tech merger last quarter. My end-of-year bonus alone could buy Terrence's entire failing agency 3 times over. But I did not correct them. I let the insult wash over me, absorbing their profound ignorance like a sponge. You are so right, Chelsea, I said, offering a genuine radiant smile. I really should focus on my feminine energy. Letting Terrence manage the heavy lifting is exactly what I plan to do moving forward. I think it is time I completely step back from the financial stress. The table murmured in agreement. Calvin nodded approvingly, pointing his knife at me. See, that is a smart woman. A smart woman knows when to step back and let the man steer the ship. As they continued to eat and laugh, I looked around the room and did the math. It is a corporate habit I simply cannot turn off. The chandelier above their heads cost $20,000. I bought it. The mahogany table they are eating on cost $15,000. I bought it. Andre's mortgage is $6,000 a month. Brenda's church tithes and country club fees total $4,000 a month. Monique's luxury car lease is $1,500. It all comes from my base salary and bonuses filtered through a complex blind trust I set up years ago to protect Terrence's fragile ego. He was so busy playing the king that he completely forgot who built the castle. He never looks at the routing numbers. He never checks the transfer origins. He just swipes his black card and assumes the money is infinite. Kiara looked around the dining room with stars in her wide eyes. "This house is just so beautiful," she said softly, her voice filled with awe. "I cannot believe I get to live here. The guest house out back is bigger than my entire apartment." "Only the best for my people," Terrence boasted, raising his crystal glass high into the air. "To family, to growth, to taking things to the absolute next level. To the next level," they all echoed in unison, raising their glasses. I raised my glass of Cabernet and leaned over to clink it against Terrence's glass. The crystal made a sharp, clear ring that resonated through the room. I looked deep into his eyes. He looked back with complete arrogance, thinking he had broken me, thinking I was a conquered, submissive woman who would rather share her husband than lose her luxury lifestyle. He had no idea that the ring of the crystal was a starting bell. 30 days. That is all I need. 30 days to legally untangle the web of blind trusts and limited liability companies I created. 30 days to let him dig his own grave so deep he will never see sunlight again. I will let them enjoy their short ribs tonight. I will let them toast to their fake empire. Because by the end of next month, these people will not even be able to afford a value meal at a drive-thru. The morning after the Sunday dinner, Terrence found me in the master suite. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms, looking like a man who had just conquered a small nation. He had that arrogant smirk playing on his lips, the one he wore when he thought he had successfully manipulated a situation to his absolute advantage. "Camille," he said, his voice dripping with faux appreciation, "I am really proud of how you handled yourself last night. A lot of women would have thrown a fit, but you showed real maturity. You understand the vision." I turned away from my vanity mirror and gave him a soft, understanding nod. "I just want you to be happy, Terrence. You carry so much weight for this family. If having Kiara close by gives you the peace you need to focus on your agency, then I support it. We have to be progressive." He walked over and kissed my forehead. It was the kiss of a king blessing a loyal peasant. "That is my girl," he whispered. "I am moving her into the guest house this afternoon. It just makes logistical sense. I do not want to be driving back and forth across Atlanta when I am trying to close these European contracts." Logistical sense. He was moving his 24-year-old mistress into my backyard, and he was framing it as a time management strategy. "The guest house is perfect for her," I replied, smoothing the lapels of his expensive suit. "Make sure she has everything she needs." I watched him walk out of the room, his chest puffed out completely high on his own perceived dominance. He truly believed his masculine authority had subdued me. He did not realize that a woman who is genuinely defeated cries, screams, and fights. A woman who agrees instantly and smiles brightly is a woman who is busy digging your grave. By 2 in the afternoon, the circus arrived. I stood by the bay window in the kitchen, sipping a cup of black coffee, watching a black luxury SUV pull up the winding driveway. Terrence stepped out, playing the ultimate gentleman as he opened the passenger door for Kiara. She emerged wearing oversized sunglasses and a matching designer tracksuit, looking like a reality television star arriving at a luxury villa. Terrence helped the driver unload 6 massive Louis Vuitton suitcases. I recognized the luggage set instantly. He had purchased it 2 days ago. The alert from my corporate subsidiary account had pinged on my phone while I was in a board meeting. I had simply filed the receipt in a digital folder labeled Exhibits right next to the documentation of his failing business loans. They walked toward the guest house. Calling it a guest house was an understatement. I had spent $200,000 renovating that space 3 years ago. It featured a full chef's kitchen vaulted ceilings, a marble bathroom with a soaking tub, and a private terrace that overlooked the infinity pool. It was an architectural masterpiece. I had designed it as a quiet retreat for myself, a place to read and review corporate contracts away from the noise of the main house. Now it was a complimentary luxury suite for a girl who thought the word mortgage was just a suggestion. It did not take long for Kiara to get comfortable. Barely 2 hours after her suitcases crossed the threshold, the back doors of the guest house swung open. Kiara strutted out onto the limestone patio, wearing a tiny, brightly colored bikini and a sheer cover-up. She made a direct line for the main infinity pool. I walked out onto the covered veranda carrying a fresh pitcher of iced tea. Kiara dropped her oversized designer tote onto one of the imported teak lounge chairs and stretched her arms above her head. "Oh, Camille," she called out, completely devoid of shame or hesitation. "This pool is absolutely gorgeous." Terrence said, "I have full access to all the amenities. Do you happen to have any fresh towels? The ones in the guest house are a little stiff and my skin is super sensitive." She was testing the waters. She wanted to see how far she could push the boundaries of this new arrangement. She expected me to snap to mark my territory, to remind her that she was an intruder. Instead, I set the pitcher down on the patio table and offered her a bright, welcoming smile. "Of course, Kiara," I said smoothly. "The towels in the guest house are just for decoration, really. Let me go to the main linen closet and get you the Egyptian cotton ones. We want you to be completely comfortable while you are staying with us." Her face fell for a fraction of a second. She had geared up for a fight, and I had handed her a fluffy towel instead. "Oh," she stammered, caught off guard. "Thank you. Also, what is the Wi-Fi password out here? My phone is not connecting and I need to upload some content. My followers are begging for a house tour." I walked back towards the sliding glass doors, pausing to look at her over my shoulder. "The password is Terrence is King, all lowercase. I will be right back with those towels. Can I pour you a glass of iced tea while you wait?" "That would be great," she said, visibly relaxing as she laid back on the lounger, adjusting her sunglasses. I walked back into the cool air conditioning of the main house. I went to the linen closet and pulled out the thickest, softest white towels I could find. I was the perfect host. I was the most accommodating, understanding wife in the history of Atlanta. Let her upload her house tour. Let her show her followers the marble countertops and the infinity pool. Let her brag about the luxurious lifestyle her wealthy sports agent boyfriend was providing. Digital footprints are a beautiful thing when you are building a case for financial asset recovery. Every photo she posted, every luxury she claimed was just more evidence of Terrence's bleeding marital funds. I carried the towels outside and draped them carefully over the edge of her lounge chair. I poured her a glass of iced tea with plenty of ice, just the way you would serve a guest at a five-star resort. "Thank you so much, Camille," she murmured, taking a sip and looking out over the water. "You are honestly so sweet. Terrence said you were reasonable, but I did not expect you to be this cool about everything. Most women are just so insecure." I smiled down at her, my eyes completely dead behind my cheerful facade. "Insecurity is a waste of energy, Kiara. I believe in giving people exactly what they want. You just focus on relaxing and bringing Terrence that soft energy he needs. Leave all the hard work to me." I turned and walked back inside, leaving her to bask in the Georgia sun. She thought she had won the lottery. Terrence thought he had achieved the ultimate patriarchal dream. They had absolutely no idea that every demand they made, every boundary they crossed, was just another nail in the coffin I was meticulously building for them. The guest house was officially occupied, but the real cost of her stay was about to get astronomically high. It started before 9 in the morning on Tuesday. I was sitting at the kitchen island finalizing the integration strategy for a mid-cap healthcare acquisition when Kiara strolled in wearing one of Terrence's oversized silk robes. She poured herself a matcha latte, sighed heavily, and announced that the guest house energy was completely misaligned with her aura. The Italian leather sofas were too masculine. The mahogany accents were blocking her creative flow. She claimed she needed a lighter, more ethereal aesthetic to truly ground herself in the space. Terence, who had just walked in tying his custom silk tie, did not miss a beat. He reached into his tailored jacket, pulled out his sleek metal black card, and dropped it onto the marble counter with a dramatic clatter. He told her to fix the energy. He told her to buy absolutely whatever she needed to make the space feel like hers. By 10 o'clock, the cavalry had arrived. Monique practically kicked the front door open, holding a venti iced coffee and wearing a manicured expression of pure greed. Chelsea floated in right behind her, carrying a canvas tote bag and a clipboard. They completely ignored me sitting at my laptop. I was a ghost in my own kitchen, a temporary fixture they simply had to step around. Chelsea rested her hands on Kiara's shoulders, offering a serene, deeply condescending smile. "We are going to curate a beautiful healing sanctuary for you," Kiara, Chelsea crooned. "It is so important for women to claim their physical spaces to avoid internalizing patriarchal trauma. Terence wants you to feel safe, so we are going to fully lean into an organic minimalist redesign today." Monique snatched the black card off the counter, waving it like a winning lottery ticket. "We are hitting Phipps Plaza first, then the design district. Terence said no budget, so we are doing this right." They giggled like teenagers heading to a mall on their father's dime. On their way out, Monique paused by my chair, looking down at my scattered financial reports. "Camille, make sure you keep the driveway clear today. We have a team from Restoration Hardware coming to take measurements for the new sectional, and they need space for the truck. You might want to move your sedan out to the street so it is not in the way." I did not look up from my screen. I just typed a quick response to my chief operating officer and gave Monique a polite nod. "I will make sure the driveway is completely clear for you, Monique. Have a wonderful time curating." The front door slammed shut, leaving me in the blissful, quiet cool of my home. I opened a new browser tab. I bypassed my work emails and logged directly into my secure banking portal. Terence believed that black card was a symbol of his elite status in the sports management world. In reality, it was a high-limit corporate expense card tied directly to a dummy LLC I had set up 5 years ago. I routed exactly $25,000 into that account on the first of every month, effectively paying him an allowance so he could maintain his kingpin persona without bankrupting us. But because I owned the master account, my phone received a silent push notification for every single transaction. The first ping hit at 11:15, $4,200 at a luxury home goods boutique. The second ping hit 20 minutes later, $800 at a high-end crystal and wellness shop. I watched the numbers roll in, transferring each amount into a color-coded spreadsheet I had appropriately titled Asset Dissipation. By 1 o'clock, they had moved from home decor to personal maintenance. I watched the card get swiped for $1,200 at a premier Buckhead day spa. Another $3,000 dropped at a designer shoe boutique. They were not just redecorating a guest house. They were throwing a massive unrestrained party on my dime, entirely convinced that Terrence's non-existent sports empire was funding their lavish afternoon. At 3:30, the delivery truck started arriving. I sat on the veranda with a cup of green tea, watching as workers hauled out the beautiful imported leather furniture I had carefully selected 3 years ago, replacing it with overpriced, trendy boucle sofas and abstract woven wall art. Kiara stood in the courtyard, pointing and directing the movers with absolute authority. Monique and Chelsea flanked her, holding shopping bags from Prada and Neiman Marcus, looking utterly exhausted from the arduous task of spending someone else's money. When they finally marched back into the main house, dropping their luxury shopping bags onto the foyer floor, they treated me exactly like a nuisance roommate. Kiara collapsed onto the living room sofa, kicking off her new designer heels. "Camille, do you think we could get the housekeeper to come a day early this week?" Kiara asked, scrolling through her phone. "With all the moving boxes, the guest house is just a dusty mess, and my allergies are acting up." Chelsea chimed in from the kitchen, where she was helping herself to my imported sparkling water. "Actually, Camille, it would be super helpful if you could handle breaking down the cardboard boxes." Terrence gets so stressed when there is clutter, and we really want to preserve his peace when he gets home. It is all about maintaining a harmonious ecosystem for him. I looked at the mountain of designer bags in the hallway. I looked at the empty, sparkling water bottle Chelsea had just tossed into the recycling bin. They were treating me like the hired help. They were completely stripping me of my dignity, expecting me to clean up the debris of the life they were actively stealing from me. I stood up, smoothed the skirt of my dress, and offered Chelsea a warm, accommodating smile. You are absolutely right, Chelsea. A harmonious ecosystem is key. I will handle the boxes right away. We definitely do not want Terrence stressing over clutter. Monique rolled her eyes, muttering something under her breath about how I should have offered in the first place, before grabbing her designer bags and heading toward the kitchen to raid the refrigerator. I walked out to the courtyard and began breaking down the massive cardboard boxes. I flattened the thick cardboard, stacking the pieces neatly by the recycling bins. I did not feel humiliated. I did not feel small. With every box I crushed, I thought about the spreadsheet currently open on my laptop. In a single afternoon, they had swiped that black card for a total of $14,750. Terrence thought he was flexing his wealth. Monique and Chelsea thought they were living the high life on their brother's dime. Kiara thought she had secured a permanent bag. They were entirely oblivious to the fact that Georgia is an equitable distribution state, and every single dime Terrence spent on his mistress outside of the marital unit was legally categorized as dissipation of marital assets. I was not just breaking down boxes, I was building a meticulous, undeniable paper trail of financial infidelity. Every custom rug, every designer shoe, every spa treatment was another stone in the avalanche I was preparing to drop on their heads. They thought I was a pushover, a weak woman clinging to a broken marriage. They did not realize that I was simply allowing the meter to run up. I finished stacking the cardboard and dusted off my hands. I pulled my phone from my pocket and checked the banking portal one last time. Another transaction had just cleared. $600 for a private catering service to deliver dinner to the guest house. I smiled, the cool afternoon breeze washing over me. Let them eat well tonight. Let them enjoy the luxury, the aesthetic, the soft energy. The financial trap was expanding beautifully, and they were sprinting right into it, completely blind, laughing all the way to the slaughter. Friday evening arrived with the obnoxious roar of a sports car engine echoing through the driveway. Terrence was taking Kiara out to a highly exclusive downtown club. He had spent an hour in front of the mirror adjusting a designer watch that I had purchased for his birthday, preparing to show his brand new prize off to his inner circle of equally delusional friends. Monique and Chelsea had already left for the night, completely exhausted from their arduous day of spending my money. For the first time all week, the massive estate was dead silent. I stood at the top of the grand staircase and watched the taillights of his leased sports car disappear down the street. The moment the heavy iron gates clicked shut, my pleasant, accommodating wife persona vanished entirely. I turned on my heel and walked directly down the hall to Terrence's home office. The room was a monument to his fragile masculinity. Dark mahogany walls framed jerseys from athletes he had never actually represented, and a massive oak desk that had not seen a legitimate contract in over 2 years. Behind a framed photograph of Terrence shaking hands with a minor local politician sat his wall safe. He thought he was incredibly secretive about it. He actually believed he had secured his private domain. But Terrence was a creature of profound narcissism, meaning the passcode was simply his own birth date, followed by his jersey number from college. I punched in the 6 digits. The heavy steel door clicked and swung open with a soft mechanical whir. I was not entirely sure what I expected to find. Perhaps a stack of unpaid invoices, maybe some jewelry receipts for Kiara, or overdue tax notices he had been hiding. Instead, sitting right on top of a stack of empty cash envelopes, was a thick manila folder labeled Strictly Confidential. The letterhead on the front belonged to attorney Richard Jenkins, my father-in-law, Calvin's longtime golfing buddy, and a man notorious in Atlanta for handling messy, high-profile divorces. I pulled the folder out, sat in Terrence's oversized leather executive chair, and turned on the desk lamp. I opened the file. Lying right there on top was a drafted, fully prepared divorce petition. I did not gasp. I did not cry. My heart rate did not even elevate. I simply leaned forward, my eyes scanning the legal jargon with the cold, precise efficiency of a corporate auditor reviewing a hostile takeover bid. The petition was set to be filed in exactly 30 days. They had orchestrated a timeline. The guest house remodel, the sudden introduction of Kiara, the suffocating presence of his family. It was all a coordinated distraction to keep me off balance while they finalized the legal paperwork behind my back. But the divorce petition was only the beginning. Beneath it lay a 20-page asset division strategy that was so breathtakingly malicious, I almost had to admire the sheer audacity. Calvin and his golf buddy had crafted a blueprint to financially annihilate me. Years ago, when I first started moving up the corporate ladder and securing massive bonuses, Terrence threw a massive temper tantrum about feeling emasculated. To pacify him, I had set up a few domestic holding companies and listed him as a managing member on paper. He had no voting rights and zero access to the actual capital, but his name was technically on the corporate filings. It was a superficial gesture to soothe his ego. Attorney Jenkins had found a legal loophole regarding those specific Georgia filings. The strategy outlined in the folder detailed a plan to argue that my lucrative mergers and acquisitions career, my stock options, and all the revenue generated by my firm were marital property heavily influenced by Terrence's quote-unquote managerial guidance. Meanwhile, they had conveniently structured Terrence's sports agency as a separate entity heavily burdened by debt. Their plan was a classic predatory squeeze. In exactly 30 days, they were going to blindside me with the divorce papers, file an emergency injunction to freeze all of my personal and corporate bank accounts, and claim that I was a flight risk with marital funds. They planned to lock me out of the estate, drain my liquid assets through prolonged litigation, and saddle me with the $2 million of debt Terrence had secretly accumulated in his failing agency. They wanted to leave me absolutely destitute. They wanted me walking out of this marriage with nothing but the clothes on my back while Terrence moved Kiara into the master suite funded entirely by the wealth I had built with my own blood, sweat, and tears. I sat back in the heavy leather chair. The silence of the office felt thick, heavy with the magnitude of their betrayal. This was not just a cheating husband making a foolish mistake. This was an entire family conspiring to rob me blind and leave me ruined. Calvin had orchestrated the legal trap. Brenda was keeping me occupied with her passive-aggressive demands. Monique and Chelsea were bleeding my daily funds dry. And Terrence was playing the confident king, eagerly waiting for the timer to run out so he could steal my crown. I read through the 30-day timeline one more time. Day 1, file the petition. Day 2, freeze the accounts. Day 3, serve the eviction notice on the spouse. I closed the manila folder, making sure the edges were perfectly aligned, and placed it exactly where I had found it in the safe. I closed the heavy steel door, spun the dial, and wiped the keypad clean with the sleeve of my cardigan. A profound, chilling clarity washed over me. I stood up in the dark, silent office. 30 days. They thought they had me on a 30-day countdown. They thought they had outsmarted a woman whose literal profession is dismantling multi-billion-dollar corporations and hunting down hidden liabilities. They had brought a pocket knife to a nuclear war. I walked out of the office and pulled my phone from my pocket. The time for playing the accommodating soft energy wife was officially over. I opened my encrypted messaging application and typed a single line to my lead international asset manager in Zurich. Initiate the Ghost Protocol immediately. Prepare for a total asset relocation. We have less than a month. I hit send. I walked up the grand staircase, my posture perfect, my mind entirely focused. They wanted to use a legal loophole to steal my wealth. They were about to find out that while they were plotting to freeze my domestic accounts, I was already moving the entire ocean across the Atlantic. The heavy footsteps echoed across the hardwood floor of the foyer. I did not even need to look up from my laptop to know who had just let himself into my home. The heavy dragging gate belonged to Andre. Terrence's older brother carried himself with the unearned confidence of a man who firmly believed the world owed him a living simply because he existed. Andre swaggered into the kitchen wearing a designer tracksuit and a fresh pair of sneakers that I had undoubtedly paid for last month. He bypassed me entirely, making a direct line for the stainless steel refrigerator. He pulled out a bottle of imported spring water, twisted the cap off, and took a long gulp before finally acknowledging my presence. "Morning, Camille," Andre said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "You are looking very focused today. Terrence around." I kept my eyes fixed on my monitors, closing out the banking portal and opening a blank document. "Terrence is currently resting in the guest house," I replied smoothly. "He had a very late night handling client relations at the club. I believe Kiara is helping him review some contracts over breakfast." Andre did not even flinch. He did not show an ounce of shame or embarrassment at the mention of his brother's 24-year-old mistress sleeping 50 feet away in my backyard. He just chuckled a deep, booming sound that grated against my nerves. "Right, right?" Andre nodded, leaning against the marble island. "A man has to balance his energy. Listen, Terrence told me to come see you this morning. We talked about it at dinner on Sunday. I need that $50,000 capital injection for my new logistics venture. He said you would handle the logistics and cut the check." The absolute audacity of this man was a marvel to witness. He was standing in my kitchen, drinking my water, openly validating the presence of my husband's mistress, and boldly asking me to hand him $50,000. He truly believed I was just the household secretary, a glorified bank teller meant to facilitate Terrence's royal decrees. I closed my laptop and offered Andre a warm professional smile. "Of course, Andre," Terrence mentioned it. "A logistics venture is a massive undertaking. I am fully prepared to facilitate the capital injection today. We just need to handle a tiny bit of corporate paperwork first." Andre groaned, rolling his eyes as if I had just asked him to perform manual labor. "Come on, Camille. We are family. Why do we need to make it all corporate and stiff?" Terrence said he had my back. "Just write the check so I can get these trucks on the road." I stood up and smoothed the skirt of my dress. "Because we are family, Andre, we have to do things by the book. Terrence's agency is growing so rapidly that his accountants are demanding pristine records for all outbound investments. It protects him and it protects you. It will only take 2 minutes. Wait right here." I walked down the hall to my home office, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floorboards. I unlocked my desk drawer and pulled out a specific heavy leather checkbook. I did not pull the checkbook for the Vanguard Heritage Trust, the blind account I usually use to fund their lives. If I wrote him a check from that account, it would legally be considered a personal gift from the marital estate. Instead, I pulled the checkbook for Apex Holdings. It was a subsidiary corporate entity I had created years ago, one where Terrence was listed as the primary managing director, but the funding mechanisms were strictly tied to the performance of his sports agency. It was a corporate debt vehicle. I quickly drafted a promissory note. I wrote the terms in plain, standard legal English, but the underlying mechanics were a lethal financial trap. The document stated that the $50,000 was a direct corporate loan from Terrence's agency to Andre's new logistics company. I embedded a specific acceleration clause. If Terrence's agency ever defaulted on its own debts or filed for bankruptcy, Andre's $50,000 loan would immediately become due in full, with a staggering 20% penalty interest rate attached. Furthermore, it contained a cross-collateralization agreement, meaning a default would instantly place a lien on Andre and Chelsea's primary residence. I printed the document, clipped it to a fresh pen, and wrote out the check for $50,000. I walked back into the kitchen. Andre was busy scrolling through his phone, completely unbothered by the world around him. "Here we go," I said cheerfully, sliding the paperwork and the check across the marble island. "Just sign at the bottom by the yellow sticky note. It basically just says the funds are a business-to-business loan from Terrence's agency to your new LLC." Andre did not read a single word. He did not glance at the acceleration clause. He did not notice the lien provision. He simply saw the bold numbers on the check, grabbed the pen, and scribbled his signature across the bottom line. "You are a lifesaver, Camille." Andre grinned, folding the check and shoving it into his pocket. "I knew you would not make a big deal out of this. You are a smart woman. You know how to play your position. Terrence is lucky to have a wife who understands the assignment. I took the signed promissory note and slid it carefully into my folder. You have no idea how well I understand the assignment, Andre. I wish you nothing but the absolute best with your new trucking fleet. Make sure you tell Chelsea hello for me. I will, he called out, already walking toward the front door. We will see you at the celebration dinner this weekend. Terrence is going all out. The heavy oak door shut behind him. I stood in the kitchen alone, staring at the freshly signed legal document in my hands. Andre thought he had just secured free money to fund his underground gambling habits. He thought he had successfully manipulated his pushover sister-in-law. What he had actually done was sign away his entire future. When the 30-day timer ran out and Terrence's agency officially collapsed under the weight of its $2 million debt, this promissory note would activate like a landmine. The creditors tearing Terrence apart would immediately inherit this note. They would seize Andre's bank accounts. They would put a lien on the eco-friendly modern home Chelsea was so deeply proud of. Andre had just legally tethered his own throat to his brother's sinking ship. I placed the promissory note inside a secure fireproof envelope. I had effectively cut off their future, and they had thanked me for doing it. I walked back to my computer monitors, the screen glowing brightly with the interface of my secure Swiss banking portal. The domestic traps were officially set. It was time to initiate the most crucial phase of the operation. It was time to start moving the real money. I had barely closed the secure banking portal on my laptop when the soft padding of bare feet against the hardwood floor caught my attention. I looked up. Kiara was drifting into the kitchen. She was wearing a matching cashmere lounge set that I recognized instantly. It was purchased yesterday at a luxury boutique for $1,200 on the black card I was currently tracking. She looked entirely too comfortable. She walked straight to the built-in espresso machine, bypassing me completely, and began pressing buttons with the casual entitlement of a woman who believed she already owned the place. "Good morning, Kiara," I said smoothly. "Did you sleep well?" She turned around, holding a delicate porcelain cup. She leaned against the marble counter, crossing her ankles. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and arrogant triumph. "I slept amazingly, Camille. The guest house is coming along beautifully. The new sofas completely changed the energy. Terrence has such a great eye for what I need." I nodded, maintaining a perfectly pleasant expression. He has always been very focused on making sure everyone has exactly what they deserve. Kiara took a sip of her espresso. She set the cup down and crossed her arms. "Actually, Camille, since it is just the two of us right now, I think we should have an honest conversation about the transition." "The transition?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "Yes," Kiara sighed, playing the role of the mature, enlightened woman. "Terrence and I were talking last night. He really appreciates how cooperative you are being with the ethical non-monogamy arrangement. But we both know this is just a stepping stone. Terrence needs a fresh start. He is building a massive empire, and he needs a partner whose energy is entirely focused on his legacy." I clasped my hands together, resting them on my laptop. "I completely agree, Kiara. His legacy is incredibly important." She smiled, a smug, radiant expression that lit up her youthful face. "I am so glad you understand, because Terrence is actually going to be transferring the deed to this main house into my name. We are starting the paperwork this week. Once the legal team clears everything by the end of the month, this estate is going to be my primary residence." The absolute breathtaking comedy of her statement hung in the air. Terrence had actually promised her the house. He was playing the ultimate billionaire sugar daddy, promising a 24-year-old girl a $1.5 million estate in Buckhead. There was just one massive, insurmountable problem. Terrence did not own the house. His name was not on the deed, the mortgage, or any municipal property record. 5 years ago, I purchased this entire estate through a discreet offshore limited liability company registered in Geneva. I am the sole managing director and beneficiary of that corporate entity. Terrence's name is on a completely worthless domestic shell company that holds zero assets. He cannot transfer the deed to Kiara because he possesses absolutely zero legal authority to do so. He is promising her a kingdom he does not even have the keys to visit. But Kiara did not know that. She was staring at me, waiting for the devastating blow to register. She was waiting for me to shatter into a million pieces, to cry, to beg, to scream that this was my home. I did not blink. I offered her a warm, dazzling smile. Kiara, that is absolutely wonderful news, I said, my voice dripping with genuine enthusiasm. Terrence is so generous. Putting this massive property in your name is a huge step for your relationship. You must be completely thrilled. Her smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. My reaction was entirely off script. She had prepared for a battle and I had handed her a bouquet of flowers. I am thrilled, Kiara said, recovering quickly and lifting her chin. We are going to do a massive renovation. Tear down these dark cabinets, bring in a lot more natural light. Make it perfect for entertaining Terrence's new European clients. But do not worry, Camille. Terrence said you can take some of the older furniture when you move out. Maybe the guest bedroom set, since we will be turning that room into my content creation studio anyway. That is incredibly thoughtful of both of you, I replied, standing up from my bar stool. I walked over to the espresso machine and picked up a fresh pod. Moving can be so stressful. Knowing I have some furniture to take with me is a huge relief. I placed the pod into the machine and pressed the button, the rich aroma of roasted coffee beans filling the kitchen. Kiara watched me, completely unnerved by my serene disposition. You are taking this really well, she muttered, her eyes narrowing slightly. Why wouldn't I asked, turning around to hand her a fresh linen napkin for her cup. You and Terrence are handling all the heavy lifting. Managing an estate like this is a massive legal and financial responsibility. Property taxes, maintenance liability. By taking this house off my hands, you are essentially freeing me to focus entirely on my own future. It is a gift, Kiara. She took the napkin, her confidence momentarily shaken by my absolute lack of resistance. Well, yes, it is a big responsibility, but I am ready to be the woman of the house. And you will be, I promised her smoothly. You are going to get exactly what you have earned. I took my fresh espresso and walked back to my laptop. I looked at Kiara standing in my kitchen, wearing clothes I paid for, drinking coffee I bought, standing on floors I owned, bragging about a property transfer that was legally impossible. As a corporate mergers and acquisitions specialist, I do not see romantic rivals. I see hostile entities attempting to acquire toxic assets. Kiara was investing her entire youth and future into a bankrupt man. She was acquiring a mountain of debt wrapped in a designer suit. Take your time getting settled today, Kiara, I said, opening my laptop screen. Terrence is going to need you to be completely energized for the weeks ahead. There is going to be a lot of transition happening by the end of the month. I am ready, she said proudly, turning and walking back toward the sliding glass doors that led to the guest house. I watched her leave. The moment the glass door slid shut, I opened a direct communication line to my real estate attorney. I typed a brief, precise message. Draft an immediate notice of eviction for all occupants of the Buckhead estate, excluding myself. The effective date is the 1st of next month. Have the documents finalized and ready for immediate execution. I hit send. Terrence was selling her a fairy tale, but I was the author writing the final chapter. In exactly 28 days, Terrence was going to present her with a forged, worthless deed to keep her compliant. And on that exact same night, my attorneys were going to present them both with a legally binding, immediate eviction notice. Kiara wanted to be the woman of the house. By the end of the month, she would be incredibly lucky if she could afford a cardboard box on the side of the highway. The kitchen was quiet again. I closed my laptop, finished my espresso, and prepared to head into the office. The domestic illusions were perfectly in place. Now I needed to execute the international financial strategy. It was time to initiate the Ghost Protocol. The interior of my Mercedes was a silent sanctuary compared to the circus I had just left behind. I merged onto the highway, heading straight for the glass and steel fortress in Midtown Atlanta, where I actually ruled my life. Terrence called my career a cute desk job. He had absolutely no comprehension of what a senior vice president of mergers and acquisitions actually does. He thought I spent my days color-coding spreadsheets and ordering office supplies. He never realized that my daily routine involved dismantling companies, liquidating toxic assets, and legally burying financial liabilities. Today, the toxic asset I was liquidating was my marriage. I stepped off the private elevator onto the 42nd floor. The reception area buzzed with the quiet, high-stakes energy of corporate finance. My executive assistant handed me my schedule and a fresh black coffee without breaking stride. I walked into my corner office, locked the heavy glass door behind me, and sat at my polished mahogany desk. It was time to execute the ghost protocol. You cannot simply wire $8.5 million out of domestic accounts without triggering a massive federal alert. Banks panic, algorithms flag the transaction, spouses get notified. If I moved the money carelessly, Calvin's shady lawyer would file an emergency freeze before the funds even cleared the Atlantic. I had to do this flawlessly, hiding the transfer in plain sight by utilizing the very corporate structures Terrence found so incredibly boring. I opened a secure video conference line with my lead international wealth manager in Zurich. His name was Elias. He was brilliant, discreet, and accustomed to handling high-net-worth clients who required absolute financial privacy. "Good afternoon, Camille," Elias said, his crisp European accent echoing softly in my office. "I received your message. Are we initiating the corporate expansion?" "We are," I replied, pulling up the necessary authorization codes on my secondary monitor. "I am establishing a new European subsidiary for cross-border acquisitions. The new entity will be fully capitalized by the end of the month. I need you to open the receiving accounts under the Swiss corporate umbrella immediately." Elias did not ask personal questions. He simply nodded and began typing. "I will structure it as a direct foreign investment from your primary domestic holding company. Completely standard, 100% legal. The Swiss privacy laws will shield the beneficiary details from any domestic civil inquiries." That was the beauty of my strategy. I was not hiding marital funds from a divorce court. I was conducting a legitimate, fully documented business expansion for an LLC that I owned prior to my marriage. Because Terrence and I had always filed our taxes separately at his insistence, supposedly to protect me from his agency's aggressive write-offs, he had inadvertently handed me the perfect legal shield. He had legally isolated my corporate earnings from his personal failures. I spent the next 4 hours orchestrating a masterpiece of financial engineering. I liquidated high-yield stock portfolios that Terrence did not even know existed. I cashed out domestic mutual funds and moved the capital into my primary corporate holding account. I layered the transactions, breaking the massive sum into structured corporate transfers labeled as international vendor payments, subsidiary capitalization, and overseas legal retainers. Every single move was airtight. Every wire transfer had a corresponding contract, a legitimate invoice, and a flawless paper trail. If Calvin's golf buddy lawyer ever managed to subpoena my corporate records, he would not find a scorned wife hiding money. He would find a thriving international business expanding into the European market entirely out of his jurisdictional reach. I sat back in my chair and watched the progress bars on my screens. The first $2 million had already cleared domestic processing. The funds were currently flying across the ocean, transforming from accessible Atlanta wealth into untouchable Swiss capital. I thought about Terrence waking up in the guest house. He was probably stretching his arms, admiring the expensive new boucle sofas Kiara had picked out, completely convinced he was the master of his domain. He truly believed he had secured his future. He thought his only task for the next 30 days was keeping me distracted while his lawyer finalized the paperwork to steal my assets. His sheer, unadulterated ignorance was my greatest weapon. For 10 years, he had never once asked to look at our combined financial statements. He never asked to see my tax forms. He was so consumed by the need to project wealth that he never bothered to understand how wealth was actually maintained. He just swiped the black card I gave him and let his ego do the rest. The second wire transfer processed successfully. Another $3 million vanished from the American banking system, safely landing in a numbered account in Zurich. I checked my phone. There was a text message from Chelsea in the family group chat. She had posted a picture of a massive, overpriced floral arrangement she had just ordered for the guest house using my funds. The caption read, "Bringing more healing energy into the space for Terrence and Kiara. Growth is so beautiful." I smiled and typed a quick, cheerful reply. "The flowers are stunning, Chelsea. Healing energy is exactly what this family needs right now. I set the phone face down on my desk. They were celebrating their victory with my money, totally unaware that the floor was slowly dropping out from underneath them. I was dissolving my domestic financial footprint while sitting right next to them at the dinner table. I was turning into a financial ghost. By the end of the business day, the framework was fully operational. The accounts were linked. The offshore corporate entity was established. The legal barriers were constructed with reinforced steel. The $8.5 million would be entirely relocated by the end of the week, leaving my domestic accounts holding nothing but dust and echoes. I packed up my briefcase, feeling a profound, intoxicating sense of peace. The heavy lifting was done. Now I just had to manage the final delicate phase of the operation. I had to keep Terrence completely blind until the very last drop of capital had crossed the border. I needed him to stay arrogant, distracted, and greedy. I walked out of my corner office ready to head back to the Buckhead estate and play the role of the compliant transitioning wife. The ghost protocol was flawlessly executed. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for someone on his side to notice the water was draining from the pool. I arrived home on Thursday evening to find Terrence pacing the length of our marble foyer. He was gripping his phone so tightly his knuckles were turning white. The arrogant swagger he usually carried had been replaced by a frantic, nervous energy. I knew exactly what was happening before he even opened his mouth. The financial tripwire had been triggered. Camille, he snapped, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. My accountant just called me in an absolute panic. He says there is a massive capital drain happening across the domestic holding accounts. He is talking about millions of dollars just vanishing into foreign subsidiaries. What on earth is going on with the trust? This was the critical moment. I had anticipated this exact confrontation. Terrence did not understand corporate finance, but his accountant certainly did. If I showed even a fraction of an ounce of fear or guilt, the 30-day timeline would accelerate into an immediate legal freeze. I needed to feed the beast that drove every single decision Terrence made. His ego. I set my designer briefcase down on the entryway table. I took a slow, deliberate breath and offered him a look of profound, supportive excitement. I walked right up to him and placed my hands flat against his chest, feeling his rapid heartbeat through his custom-tailored shirt. Terrence, I whispered, keeping my tone breathless and full of admiration. I was trying to keep it a surprise until the ink was completely dry, but your accountant ruined it. I am orchestrating the biggest financial move of your entire career. He blinked, the anger in his eyes momentarily stalling. What are you talking about? The money is gone, Camille. It is not gone, baby, I said, using the pet name that always made him feel 10 feet tall. It is staged. I have been speaking with some of my high-level international contacts. There is a massive European sports conglomerate based out of Geneva. They are looking for an American agency partner to handle their overseas talent transitions. But they only partner with agencies that can demonstrate immense immediate liquid capital. They need to know their American partner is a heavy hitter. I stepped back and looked at him like he was a king. I moved the funds into a Swiss holding account under your corporate umbrella to serve as proof of liquidity. Terrence, I am positioning your agency to land a multi-million-dollar European partnership. You are about to go global. I just needed the capital staged in Europe to bypass their initial financial screening. I watched the panic drain out of his face in real time. It was replaced by a slow, creeping smirk. The idea that he was a global player and international kingmaker was a drug he could not resist. He did not ask to see the routing numbers. He did not ask to speak to my contacts. His narcissism completely blinded his basic common sense. He ran a hand over his freshly lined-up haircut and let out a deep, arrogant chuckle. A European conglomerate, he repeated, rolling the words around in his mouth like fine wine. You should have told me, Camille. You cannot just move capital like that without letting the boss know. My accountant was about to have a heart attack. I know, I smiled softly. I just wanted to hand you the contract on a silver platter. Tell your accountant to stand down and stop panicking. The funds are secure in Geneva, acting as your financial muscle. The compliance period takes about 3 weeks. Once they verify your liquidity, you are going to be representing the biggest athletes in Europe. Terrence was practically vibrating with excitement. He pulled me into a tight hug, kissing the top of my head. "This is why you are my secret weapon, Camille. You always know how to set the stage for my vision." He pulled away, already taking out his phone. "I have to call my dad. I have to tell Calvin we are expanding the agency overseas." He literally ran into the den to make the phone call. Within an hour, the entire estate was buzzing with the fake news. Brenda and Calvin drove over immediately to celebrate. Chelsea and Andre arrived with a bottle of overpriced champagne. Kiara glided out from the guest house wearing a silk slip dress hanging onto Terrence's arm and asking if they would be moving to Paris or Milan. Calvin raised his champagne flute in the living room, his chest puffed out with pride. "To my son," Calvin declared loudly, taking the family name across the ocean. "I always knew you were destined for international greatness, Terrence, a true provider." Chelsea clinked her glass against Kiara's, offering her signature condescending wisdom. "It is so beautiful how the universe is rewarding Terrence for finally aligning with his authentic truth and finding his peace." I stood in the corner of my own living room holding a glass of sparkling water, watching them toast to an absolute phantom. They were celebrating a European sports deal that did not exist, funded by money they could no longer touch. Terrence had just given his accountant the direct order to ignore the missing millions. I had completely neutralized the only financial watchdog who could have stopped me. The ghost protocol was perfectly intact and my hands were entirely clean. The next morning, the hangover of their celebration provided the perfect cover for my next phase of demolition. Over the ensuing 2 weeks, I systematically and legally dissolved the blind trust that had been secretly funding their extravagant lives. It was not enough to just take the money. I needed to sever the financial lifelines that kept their delusions afloat. I started with Brenda. My mother-in-law loved to parade her wealth at her megachurch and her exclusive country club. Her entire social standing was built on a premium titanium credit card that I paid off every 30 days. I logged into the account management portal and canceled the automatic payment authorization. I did not close the card. I just stopped paying the bill. I timed it perfectly so her massive monthly tithe and her country club renewal fees would process right as the grace period expired. She was going to swipe that card in front of her high society friends and the machine was going to decline it with absolute prejudice. Next, I moved to Andre and Chelsea. They were living in a sprawling modern home in Decatur, hosting therapy retreats and dinner parties, completely blind to the fact that their massive mortgage was auto-drafted from my corporate subsidiary. I accessed the loan servicing portal. I revoked the third-party payment authorization. The bank would now look directly to Andre for the $7,500 monthly payment. When the first of the month arrived, their eco-friendly sanctuary was going to transform into a foreclosure nightmare. Finally, I targeted Monique. She drove a pristine white luxury SUV that she treated like a personality trait. The lease agreement was secured by a corporate guarantee from my trust. I submitted the formal legal documentation to the dealership, revoking the corporate guarantor status due to a restructuring of assets. Without my signature backing the lease, the finance company would demand immediate payment in full from Monique or issue a repossession order. I knew for a fact Monique did not even have $500 in her checking account. I sat at my desk and reviewed the cancellation dates. Every single financial lifeline was set to snap on the exact same day, the first of the month, the exact day Calvin and his lawyer planned to serve me with divorce papers and freeze my accounts. They thought they were orchestrating a brilliant ambush. They had no idea they were walking into a synchronized financial slaughter. It was a Tuesday night, exactly 4 days before the end of the month. The digital clock on my secondary monitor glowed a harsh, bright white in the pitch black of my home office, displaying exactly 2 in the morning. The sprawling Buckhead estate was graveyard silent. Outside, beyond the heavy silk drapes of my window, the guest house was completely dark. Terrence and his 24-year-old mistress were sound asleep, blissfully dreaming about the empire they believed they were about to steal from me. I sat perfectly still in my executive chair, listening to the absolute quiet. This was the moment, the culmination of weeks of meticulous high-stakes financial engineering. Every dummy corporation was established. Every offshore receiving account was verified and heavily insulated by Swiss privacy laws. The domestic lifelines tying my wealth to his greedy parasitic family had been cleanly severed, primed to detonate on the first of the month. There was only one thing left to do. I placed my hands on the keyboard and woke up my primary workstation. I opened the encrypted banking portal that housed our primary domestic joint accounts. These were the massive high-yield savings and checking accounts that Terence and his father Calvin were planning to freeze with their emergency injunction. They were banking their entire predatory divorce strategy on seizing this exact capital. They needed these millions to pay off Terence's hidden debt and fund Kiara's permanent transition into the main house. The screen loaded. The current balance across all linked domestic marital accounts stood at exactly $8,500,000. It was a staggering amount of liquidity, the hard-earned result of my relentless corporate grinding, my strategic acquisitions, and my massive end-of-year performance bonuses. Terence had not contributed a single dime to that balance in over 2 years, yet he fully intended to claim it all under the guise of his managerial guidance. I pulled my encrypted security token from my pocket. It generated a unique randomized 6-digit authorization code every 30 seconds. I typed my master password, followed by the newly generated code, unlocking the highest tier of transfer privileges. I selected the domestic accounts. I clicked the transfer destination, routing the funds directly to the newly established European subsidiary I had created for his fake international sports contract. I typed in the exact transfer amount: $8,499,985.68. The system prompted me for a final confirmation. A small, sterile gray box appeared on the screen asking if I was absolutely certain I wanted to initiate an irrevocable international wire transfer of this magnitude. I thought about the Sunday dinner. I thought about Brenda commanding me to set a plate for my husband's mistress. I thought about Calvin telling me to submit to his son's masculine authority. I thought about Chelsea's condescending therapy speak and Monique's unearned arrogance. I thought about Terence, my husband of 10 years, plotting with a golf buddy lawyer to throw me out onto the street with nothing but the clothes on my back. My finger hovered over the mouse. I did not feel an ounce of sadness. I did not feel a trace of hesitation or mourning for the marriage I was officially executing. I felt a profound, intoxicating rush of absolute power. I clicked confirm. The screen buffered for exactly 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds felt like an eternity, a suspended moment in time where the entire trajectory of my life hung in the digital balance. Then the progress bar flashed green. Transaction successful. Funds have been routed for international clearing. I sat back and watched the live balance on the domestic joint accounts plummet in real time. The $8.5 million vanished from the American banking system. It bypassed the federal domestic safeguards routed through a correspondent bank in Frankfurt and settled safely, securely, and irrevocably into my untouchable corporate holding account in Zurich, Switzerland. The screen refreshed. I stared at the new available balance on the domestic joint accounts, $14.32. I left them exactly $14.32. It was not a random number. $14.32 was the exact price of the 2 premium coffee orders Terence and Kiara had charged to my black card on their very first morning together in the guest house. It was the absolute maximum amount of my wealth they would ever touch again. It was a parting gift, a microscopic drop of loose change that would not even cover the parking fee at the downtown courthouse where they planned to file their fraudulent divorce petition. I locked the workstation and closed the laptop. The gentle click of the screen shutting echoed in the dark office. The financial trap was fully set. The vault was empty, the doors were locked, and the safety net was completely removed. Terence was now standing over a bottomless financial abyss, completely unsupported, holding on to a dead sports agency that owed $2 million to unforgiving creditors. I stood up, walked over to the large bay window, and pulled back the edge of the silk drape. I looked out at the guest house one last time. Tomorrow night was the grand celebration. Terence and his family had invited me to a lavish 5-star dinner at one of Buckhead's most exclusive restaurants. The stated purpose of the dinner was to celebrate his massive new European sports deal. The actual insidious purpose of the dinner was to officially parade Kiara in public as his new partner served me with the divorce papers right at the table and humiliate me in front of the entire family. They thought they were setting up my public execution. They thought they had backed me into a corner where my only options were to cry beg or surrender my dignity. They were completely oblivious to the fact that I was walking into that restaurant as a financial grim reaper. I let the drape fall back into place. I walked out of the office and headed up the grand staircase to get some rest. I needed to look absolutely radiant for tomorrow evening. You only get one chance to attend your own hostile takeover, and I fully intended to be the best-dressed woman at the funeral of their entire privileged existence. I woke up the next morning with the kind of profound clarity that only comes from knowing you hold the detonator. I spent the entire afternoon preparing for the dinner. This was not just a meal. It was a hostile corporate takeover disguised as a family gathering, and I needed to look the part. I bypassed my usual conservative business suits and chose a fitted emerald green Tom Ford midi dress. Green is the color of money, the color of envy, and the color of a cleared international wire transfer. I paired it with my highest Christian Louboutin stilettos. I wanted my footsteps to sound like a gavel dropping when I walked into that room. The reservation was at a highly exclusive five-star steakhouse in the heart of Buckhead. When I handed my keys to the valet and walked through the heavy glass doors, the hostess immediately escorted me to the private mahogany dining room Terrence had reserved. I pushed open the double doors and stepped inside. The entire room was already buzzing with obnoxious, unearned celebration. Terrence sat at the absolute head of the long dining table, looking like a king presiding over his loyal court. Kiara was plastered to his right side, wearing a gaudy diamond tennis bracelet that I knew for an absolute fact was charged to my corporate subsidiary account exactly 6 days ago. Brenda sat to his left, glowing with the fierce protective pride of a mother who believed her son had just conquered the world. Calvin, Andre, Chelsea, and Monique occupied the middle seats drinking premium cocktails and laughing loudly. There was only one empty chair remaining. They had deliberately placed it at the complete opposite end of the long table, isolating me entirely. It was a physical manifestation of their strategy. They wanted me marginalized, disconnected, and staring down the barrel of their unified front. I did not flinch. I offered a warm, radiant smile to the room, walked the length of the table with my head held high, and gracefully took my designated seat in the back. "You look beautiful tonight, Camille," Terrence called out from across the room, raising his glass of bourbon. It was the condescending tone of a victor showing mercy to the defeated. "Thank you, Terrence," I replied smoothly, unfolding my linen napkin and placing it in my lap. "I feel absolutely fantastic." The waiter arrived and poured vintage champagne into our crystal flutes. Terrence had pre-ordered 2 bottles of Dom Perignon, fully expecting his black card to absorb the monumental cost at the end of the night. He stood up, tapping his silver fork against his glass to command the room's attention. Family Terrence began puffing out his chest. "Tonight is a milestone. As you all know, my agency has officially secured international backing. We have millions staged in Zurich right now, paving the way for the biggest European sports contracts this city has ever seen. We are going global." But I could not have reached this peak without the unwavering support of the people sitting at this table. He looked down at Kiara, squeezing her hand, and I could not have found the clarity to make these massive moves without the fresh, healing peace that Kiara has brought into my life. The table erupted into applause. Monique clapped enthusiastically. Andre whistled. Kiara blushed and buried her face in Terrence's shoulder, playing the shy, supportive muse to perfection. Brenda stood up next, holding her champagne flute high. She did not even glance in my direction. She kept her eyes entirely focused on her son and his mistress. A mother always knows when her child is carrying too heavy a burden, Brenda declared, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "Terrence, you have carried this entire family on your strong back for years. You have provided for us, protected us, and sacrificed your own happiness to do the right thing. It is time you finally prioritize your own joy." Kiara. "Welcome to the family. You are exactly the breath of fresh air my son desperately needed. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my champagne. It was crisp cold and tasted like absolute victory. They were toasting to my money. They were thanking a 24-year-old girl for bringing peace to a man who was drowning in $2 million of hidden debt. The delusion was so thick it was practically suffocating. Chelsea, ever the performative progressive, was the next to stand. She smoothed down her beige linen dress and looked directly down the table at me, her eyes brimming with a deeply insulting artificial empathy. "I just want to take a moment to honor Camille," Chelsea said, pressing a hand to her chest. "Camille, I just want to say how incredibly brave you are. It takes a profoundly evolved woman to accept a transitional phase in a marriage. Growth is uncomfortable, but stepping aside, releasing your ego, and letting Terrence fully step into his authentic power is the most beautiful ethical gift you could possibly give him. We all see your sacrifice and we honor your journey." I smiled at Chelsea, a wide, bright, terrifyingly calm smile. "Thank you, Chelsea," I said, my voice cutting through the dining room with absolute clarity. "I am a firm believer that every transition requires complete transparency. I am honoring my journey tonight more than you could possibly comprehend." Terrence chuckled, clearly mistaking my response for total submission. He took his seat and the waiters seamlessly cleared the appetizer plates, replacing them with massive cuts of dry, aged steak and butter-poached lobster tails. The family ate like royalty, gorging themselves on the finest cuisine Buckhead had to offer, entirely oblivious to the financial guillotine swinging directly above their heads. As the plates were cleared and the dessert menus were handed out, the atmosphere shifted. The celebratory chatter dialed down into a focused, predatory silence. This was the moment. The grand finale of their 30-day scheme. Terrence wiped his mouth with his napkin and leaned back in his chair. He looked at Calvin. Calvin gave a short, firm nod, reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket, and pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope. Calvin handed the envelope to Terrence. Terrence placed his hands flat on the mahogany table. He looked down at me, his arrogant smirk returning in full force. He was ready to play the ruthless businessman. "Camille," Terrence said, his voice dropping into a serious, commanding register. "We have all agreed that this ethical transition is what is best for everyone. But a transition requires legal boundaries. To protect my agency's new international assets, and to ensure Kiara and I can build our foundation without any interference, we need to restructure the household legally." He slid the thick manila envelope down the long, polished mahogany table. It glided smoothly over the wood, coming to a dead stop directly in front of my empty plate. "Those are the divorce papers," Terrence announced, his voice booming so the entire room could hear his authority. "My legal team has already filed the emergency injunctions. It outlines the division of assets. You will be vacating the main estate by the end of the week. I am keeping the primary residence, the luxury vehicles, and all operational business accounts. The documents are standard. I suggest you sign them tonight so we can handle this quietly and avoid dragging your name through a messy, prolonged court battle." The room was dead silent. Brenda watched me with a victorious glare. Monique was practically vibrating with excitement. Kiara looked down at her diamond bracelet, trying to hide her massive, triumphant smile. They were waiting for the breakdown. They wanted the tears, the screaming, the begging. They wanted the broken, discarded wife. I looked at the manila envelope. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out my favorite gold-plated Mont Blanc fountain pen. I popped the cap off, opened the thick envelope, flipped directly to the last page of the divorce petition, and signed my name on the dotted line without reading a single word. I tossed the gold-plated pen onto the center of the table. It landed with a sharp clatter that cut through the dead silence of the dining room. Terrence let out a loud, triumphant breath. He reached eagerly for the manila envelope, his eyes gleaming with the absolute certainty that he had just conquered my life. Before his fingers could even brush the paper, I reached into my designer tote bag and pulled out a thick, bright red folder. I dropped it dead center on the table. The heavy thud made the crystal glasses rattle. "Since we are handling ethical transitions tonight," I said, my voice projecting across the room with razor-sharp clarity, "I brought some finalized paperwork of my own to distribute." Terrence froze. Calvin narrowed his eyes, leaning forward. I flipped open the red cover. I pulled out a single sheet of banking letterhead and slid it directly across the mahogany table to Terrence. That is the current verified balance of our joint domestic accounts, I announced. The exact accounts your lawyer just froze with your emergency injunction. The accounts you plan to use to fund your new life. Terrence picked up the paper. His arrogant smirk did not just fade, it completely disintegrated. The blood rushed out of his face so fast he looked physically ill. He stared at the bold, printed numbers, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Calvin snatched the paper right out of his son's hands. $14.32, I read aloud, making sure the entire room heard the exact figure. I believe that covers the exact cost of the 2 iced lattes you and Kiara charged to my corporate card on your very first morning in the guest house. Keep the change. Where is the $8.5 million? Calvin roared, standing up and slamming his hands on the table. Where is the capital, Camille? The capital is currently resting comfortably in a highly secure corporate holding account in Zurich, Switzerland, I replied, offering Calvin a pristine, chilling smile. It was transferred as part of a legitimate, fully documented international business expansion for my firm. Untouchable by domestic divorce courts, completely insulated by Swiss privacy laws, and 100% mine, is done. Before the shock could fully register, I pulled out the next document. I slid a bright pink carbon copy down the table until it rested in front of Monique. Monique, I said cheerfully, that is a formal repossession order from your luxury auto dealership. Since I revoked my corporate guarantor status on your vehicle exactly 30 days ago, your lease went into immediate default. The tow truck driver texted my assistant 10 minutes ago. He is currently hooking up your pristine white SUV in the restaurant parking lot right now. You might want to ask your brother for a ride home. Monique shrieked, jumping up from her chair and scrambling for the window. I did not miss a beat. I pulled out 2 certified bank notices and slid them to Andre and Chelsea. Andre, Chelsea, please review those carefully. That is the notice of default on your sprawling, eco-friendly sanctuary in Decatur. You see, the blind trust that has been auto-drafting your $7,500 mortgage every month was dissolved. You missed your first payment. Chelsea dropped her sparkling water. The glass shattered against her plate. Andre turned pale, looking frantically at Terrence. Oh, and Andre. I continued, leaning forward and lowering my voice to a lethal pitch. Remember that $50,000 logistics loan you begged me for last month? The one you eagerly signed without reading the fine print? That was a corporate loan from Terrence's sports agency. Because Terrence's agency is completely insolvent, that loan triggered a cross-collateralization clause. The creditors now hold a direct lien on whatever equity you have left in that house. You legally tied your own throat to your brother's sinking ship. Terrence finally found his voice. It was shaking, high-pitched, and stripped of all its unearned masculine authority. The agency is not insolvent, Terrence stammered. I have the European contracts. We are going global. I laughed, a loud, genuine, echoing laugh that filled the private dining room. Terrence, there is no European sports contract. There never was. I made that up so you would tell your accountant to ignore the massive wire transfers I was sending to Switzerland. You are $2 million in high-interest debt. You have not signed a client in 2 years, and your agency is a financial graveyard. Brenda clutched her chest, her breathing shallow. Terrence, tell me she is lying. Brenda gasped. Tell me you have the money. I pulled out a stack of return checks and tossed them in front of my mother-in-law. I would not count on him, Brenda. Those are the bounce checks from your country club and your megachurch. The automatic payments failed this morning. The country club board has already voted to revoke your access, and your pastor called my office asking why your accounts were suddenly frozen. You have been playing high society on my dime, and the bank is officially closed. Kiara had been sitting frozen this entire time. Now she looked at Terrence with wide, terrified eyes. Terrence, what is she talking about? You told me we were putting the Buckhead estate in my name. You told me this was our fresh start. I pulled out the final document from the red folder. It was a formal legal notice stamped with a red seal. I slid it down the table until it touched Kiara's diamond bracelet. Terrence does not own the Buckhead estate. Kiara, I said softly. I purchased that entire property 5 years ago through a discreet offshore limited liability company. I am the sole managing director. Terrence cannot give you a house he does not own. And speaking of the estate, that document is an immediate eviction notice. It goes into effect at midnight tonight. My private security team is currently boxing up your brand new Louis Vuitton suitcases and leaving them at the end of the driveway. You have exactly 3 hours to vacate my property. Complete absolute chaos erupted in the private dining room. Kiara shot up from her chair and threw her crystal champagne flute directly at Terrence's chest. The glass bounced off his tailored suit, soaking him in expensive vintage wine. "You are broke!" Kiara screamed at him, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "You lied to me! You are a broke, pathetic fraud!" Terrence tried to grab her arm, but she slapped his hand away. "Do not touch me," she yelled, grabbing her designer bag and storming toward the double doors. "I am not going down with a bankrupt loser." As Kiara fled the restaurant, the family completely turned on each other. Andre lunged at Terrence, grabbing him by the lapels of his soaked suit. "You ruined us," Andre roared. "You told me to sign that paper. You put a lien on my house." Chelsea was sobbing uncontrollably, chanting about her ruined energy. Brenda was hyperventilating into a linen napkin while Calvin stood frozen, realizing his master legal strategy had just secured his son a lifetime of unpayable debt. By signing the divorce petition tonight, I pointed out over the screaming, "You just legally claimed all operational business accounts. You just legally bound yourself to $2 million of debt with zero marital assets to offset it. Congratulations on the ethical transition, Terrence. You got exactly what you asked for." The private dining room doors swung open. A waiter walked in, completely horrified by the screaming match happening in the corner. He nervously approached the table and set down a black leather folder. "The bill," the waiter whispered. $3,500. Terrence let go of his brother and looked at the bill, his face draining of whatever color it had left. He reached for his pocket, remembering that his black card was now permanently declined. I stood up and smoothed the front of my emerald green Tom Ford dress. I picked up my designer clutch and buttoned my coat. The panic, the devastation, and the utter ruin of the people who had tried to destroy me felt like the warmest sunshine I had ever experienced. I looked down at Terrence, who was staring at the dinner bill with hollow, defeated eyes. "You are the king, Terrence," I said, my voice dripping with icy finality. "The bill is yours." I turned my back on the screaming, crying, devastated family and walked out of the private dining room. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind me, cutting off the sounds of their implosion. I walked through the quiet elegance of the steakhouse, stepped out into the cool Atlanta night, and climbed into the waiting black car. To the airport, I told the driver, settling back into the plush leather seats. As the car merged onto the highway, carrying me toward a first-class flight to Switzerland, I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the minibar. I had protected my peace, secured my empire, and left the parasites to feed on each other. The ghost protocol was complete. I was finally free. The evening of the grand celebration arrived with the heavy, humid heat typical of an Atlanta night. I stood in front of my full-length mirror in the master suite, carefully adjusting the neckline of my black Alexander McQueen dress. I chose black intentionally. It was elegant, incredibly expensive, and the traditional color of mourning. I was dressing for a funeral, but it was certainly not my own. Terrence had booked the most exclusive private dining room at a premier 5-star steakhouse in the heart of Buckhead. It was the kind of establishment where reservations required a hefty deposit, and the waitstaff wore white gloves. He had spared absolutely no expense for this dinner, because in his mind he was not just celebrating a massive international business expansion, he was throwing a coronation. Tonight was the night he officially and publicly integrated his 24-year-old mistress into high society and, more importantly, into our family. I handed my keys to the valet and walked through the heavy mahogany doors of the restaurant. The hostess smiled warmly, recognizing me from previous corporate dinners I had hosted there. When I gave her Terrence's name, she personally escorted me past the crowded main dining floor and down a dimly lit hallway lined with vintage wine cellars. She pulled open the double doors to the private room, and I stepped inside. The scene before me was a masterpiece of unearned arrogance and absolute delusion. Terence was sitting at the head of a long, polished oak table. He wore a custom-tailored midnight blue suit, looking every inch the wealthy, untouchable sports mogul he pretended to be. Seated directly to his right in the place of honor, traditionally reserved for a spouse, was Kiara. She was draped in a skin-tight champagne-colored silk gown dripping in the gold jewelry she had charged to my corporate accounts just a few days prior. The rest of the family was strategically clustered around them. My mother-in-law Brenda sat to Kiara's right, leaning in close and laughing brightly at whatever naive comment the young girl had just made. Calvin, my father-in-law, was seated next to Terence, swirling a glass of top-shelf bourbon and puffing out his chest. Andre and Chelsea occupied the middle seats while Monique sat directly across from Kiara, actively snapping photos on her phone to document the occasion for her social media followers. There was only one empty chair left in the room. They had deliberately positioned it at the complete opposite end of the table, as far away from Terence and the center of the family as physically possible. I did not pause. I did not let my smile falter. I walked the length of the room with my head held high, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. I took my designated seat in exile, radiating an aura of total unbothered peace. "Look who finally decided to join us," Terence announced, his voice booming across the room. He raised his crystal glass, the ice clinking softly. "I was starting to think you got lost on the way, Camille." "I was just finishing up some end-of-the-month accounting," I replied smoothly, placing my clutch on the empty chair beside me. "You know how important it is to make sure every single account is perfectly balanced." Terence chuckled, completely missing the lethal double meaning of my words. He turned his attention back to Calvin, loudly boasting about the fake European sports deal I had invented for him. "The Swiss capital is locked and loaded," Dad Terence bragged, leaning back in his chair and gesturing broadly. "We bypassed the standard domestic red tape. The international holding accounts are primed. Once these European athletic directors see my liquidity, the agency is going to be handling the biggest football and basketball transfers on the continent. I'm taking this family global." Calvin raised his bourbon glass in a solemn salute. "That is what a real provider does. You stay hungry, Terence. You secure the legacy." I picked up the leather-bound menu and scanned the prices. A single dry-aged ribeye was $150. The seafood tower sitting in the center of the table, already half devoured by Andre and Monique, was easily $300. Terence had pre-ordered 4 bottles of vintage champagne. The bill for this dinner was going to easily surpass $3,000. I felt a deep, intoxicating rush of adrenaline knowing that the domestic joint accounts currently held exactly $14.32. Kiara leaned over and whispered something into Brenda's ear. Brenda let out a loud theatrical laugh and patted Kiara's hand affectionately. "It is just so wonderful to have a fresh, vibrant perspective at the table," Brenda declared, making sure her voice was loud enough to carry down to my end of the room. "A family needs new energy to keep growing. Stagnation is the enemy of progress." Chelsea nodded sagely, adjusting her beige linen wrap dress. She looked down the table at me, her eyes brimming with that toxic weaponized pity she loved to deploy. "Camille, I just have to say, your presence here tonight is a beautiful testament to emotional maturity," Chelsea said, her tone dripping with artificial sweetness. "Blending a family is never easy. It takes a very secure woman to sit at the table and embrace her husband's new chapter. We are all just so proud of how gracefully you are handling this transition. You are really doing the internal work." I looked at Chelsea. I looked at Andre, who was busy chewing on a lobster claw, completely unaware that his house was about to go into foreclosure. I looked at Monique, who was currently posting a video of Kiara to her thousands of followers, completely unaware that her luxury SUV was days away from being repossessed. "Thank you, Chelsea," I said, my voice clear and melodic. "I believe that when a chapter ends, you have to close the book completely. I am just sitting here taking it all in, enjoying the final pages of this exact dynamic." Terence signaled the waiter, ordering another round of expensive cocktails for the table. He threw his arm around Kiara's chair, pulling her closer. He was at the absolute height of his power. He had his family's total adoration, his beautiful young mistress by his side, and what he believed was a submissive broken wife sitting quietly in the corner. He had orchestrated the perfect public spectacle to cement his new life. I took a slow sip of the iced water the waiter had poured for me. I watched them laugh, drink, and celebrate their massive financial victory. The five-star setup was flawless. They had built the highest possible pedestal for Terence to stand on. All I had to do now was wait for the paperwork, and then casually push him off the edge. The waiter cleared the remaining lobster shells and polished off the last of the crumbs with a silver scraper. The table was impeccably clean, setting the stage perfectly. Brenda tapped her manicured fingernail against her crystal champagne flute. The sharp, high-pitched ring silenced the room immediately. She stood up, smoothing the front of her emerald green suit, and looked around the table with the regal authority she believed she possessed. "If I could have everyone's attention," Brenda announced, her voice resonating with practiced church lady vibrato. "I want to take a moment to bless this gathering. We are sitting here tonight because of the relentless, backbreaking hard work of one man." She turned her gaze entirely to Terence, her eyes shining with absolute adoration. She did not even glance toward my end of the table. To her, I was already a ghost. "Terence," Brenda continued, pressing a hand to her heart. "You have carried this family on your strong back for years. You have been our provider, our protector, and our anchor. The world asks so much of a successful Black man today. It asks him to build empires, to lead with strength, and to never show weakness. You have done all of that and more. You have sacrificed your own peace to make sure everyone sitting at this table lacks for absolutely nothing." I watched her raise her glass. I thought about the bounced check from her megachurch sitting safely in my red folder. I thought about the country club membership that had just been permanently revoked. I took a sip of my sparkling water and let her keep digging her own grave. And now Brenda smiled warmly, turning her attention to the 24-year-old mistress sitting in my rightful seat. "Now God has finally sent my son his reward. Kiara, you have brought such a beautiful, gentle light into Terence's life. You understand how to honor a provider. You know how to cultivate a sanctuary. We welcome you into this family with open arms and open hearts." The table erupted into enthusiastic applause. Calvin shouted a loud, booming agreement. Andre clapped his brother on the back. Monique cheered and raised her glass high. Kiara blushed, dipping her head shyly and leaning her head on Terence's shoulder. It was a sickening display of coordinated disrespect. But the performance was not over. Chelsea stood up next. She adjusted her beige linen wrap dress, looking down the long expanse of the mahogany table directly at me. She wore an expression of deep performative sorrow, the kind she usually reserved for discussing her expensive yoga retreats. "I just want to add something very important to Brenda's beautiful words," Chelsea said softly, ensuring the whole room was quiet enough to catch every syllable of her condescension. "I want to raise my glass to Camille." The room went still. Terence raised an eyebrow. Kiara looked momentarily confused. "Camille," Chelsea continued, her voice dripping with toxic, weaponized empathy. "I know this evening might feel challenging for you, but I want to tell you how incredibly brave you are for accepting your transitional phase in Terence's life. So many women let their egos destroy the family ecosystem when a marriage naturally evolves. But you are sitting here bearing witness to Terence's new truth and allowing him to step into his highest self without resistance. That is true emotional maturity. We honor your sacrifice, and we wish you nothing but healing as you move on to your next chapter." The absolute audacity of her speech hung heavy in the air. She had just publicly congratulated me for allowing my husband to replace me. She had framed my ultimate betrayal as a personal growth exercise. I did not break eye contact with her. I did not let my smile slip. I simply raised my water glass in a silent, graceful salute. "Thank you, Chelsea," I replied, my voice perfectly steady and clear. "I can assure you my transition into the next chapter is going to be the most spectacular evolution this family has ever witnessed. I am fully prepared to leave the past exactly where it belongs." Chelsea smiled, completely satisfied with herself, and took her seat. The waiters returned carrying silver trays loaded with decadent desserts. Slices of 24-karat gold leaf chocolate cake and delicate creme brulee were placed in front of everyone. The mood in the room shifted from celebratory to sharply focused. The appetizers were done. The toasts were finished. It was time for the main event. Terence cleared his throat. He sat up straighter, adjusting his custom silk tie. He looked over at his father. Calvin gave a slow, deliberate nod of approval and reached into his tailored breast pocket. Calvin pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope and handed it to his son. Terence placed his hands flat on the table, centering the envelope perfectly in front of him. He looked down the long expanse of mahogany directly at me. The arrogant smirk was back plastered across his face. He was ready to play the ruthless corporate titan, completely oblivious to the fact that he was bankrupt. Camille, Terence announced, his voice dropping into a serious, commanding register designed to echo off the walls. As Chelsea so eloquently pointed out, we are entering a new phase. We have all agreed that this ethical transition is what is best for everyone involved. But a transition of this magnitude requires absolute legal boundaries. To protect my agency's new international assets and to ensure Kiara and I can build our foundation without any interference, we need to restructure the household legally. He picked up the thick manila envelope. With a flick of his wrist, he sent it sliding down the long, polished mahogany table. It glided smoothly over the wood, coming to a dead stop directly in front of my empty dessert plate. "Those are the divorce papers," Terence declared, making sure every single person in the room heard his authority. "My legal team filed the emergency injunctions this afternoon. The document outlines the mandatory division of assets. You will be vacating the Buckhead estate by the end of this week. I am retaining the primary residence, the luxury vehicles, and all operational business accounts." He paused, letting the weight of his demands sink in. The room was utterly silent. Brenda watched me with a victorious, predatory glare. Monique was practically vibrating with excitement in her chair. Kiara looked down at her diamond tennis bracelet, trying to hide her massive, triumphant smile. They were waiting for the breakdown. They wanted the tears, the screaming, the begging. They wanted the broken, discarded wife to fall to her knees. Terence was not finished. Furthermore, he continued, his tone dripping with unearned superiority. "Given the lifestyle I have maintained and the fact that my agency is currently undergoing massive international expansion, my attorneys have calculated a mandatory permanent alimony payment from your corporate salary. I need to maintain the standard of living I have grown accustomed to. I am leaving you your little corporate retirement fund, so I expect you to sign these documents immediately. We want to handle this quietly and avoid dragging your name through a messy, prolonged court battle." He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He had laid all his cards on the table. He was demanding the house I bought, the cars I leased, and a monthly paycheck from my hard-earned salary to fund his life with his mistress. He actually believed his golf buddy lawyer had successfully trapped me. I looked down at the manila envelope resting perfectly on the dark wood. I looked at the 5 people who had conspired to bleed me dry and throw me onto the street. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or ask for an explanation. I reached into my designer clutch and felt the smooth, cold metal of my favorite gold-plated fountain pen. I was not about to beg for my marriage. I was about to finalize their financial execution. I pulled the gold-plated fountain pen from my clutch and popped the cap. I did not read a single page of the dense legal jargon Calvin and his golf buddy had so painstakingly drafted. I simply flipped directly to the back of the thick packet, found the signature line, and signed my name with a smooth, sweeping flourish. I tossed the pen onto the center of the mahogany table. It landed with a sharp clatter that cut through the dead silence of the dining room. Terence let out a loud, triumphant breath, completely misreading the situation. He reached eagerly for the manila envelope, his eyes gleaming with the absolute certainty that he had just conquered my life. He thought my swift signature was the ultimate act of a broken, submissive woman throwing in the towel. Before his fingers could even brush the paper, I reached down into my designer tote bag. I pulled out a thick, heavy, bright red folder. I dropped it dead center on the table. The heavy thud made the crystal champagne flutes rattle against the wood. "Since we are handling ethical transitions tonight, I said, my voice projecting across the room. With razor-sharp clarity, I brought some finalized paperwork of my own to distribute. Terrence froze, his hand hovering over the table. Calvin narrowed his eyes, leaning forward in his chair. I flipped open the red cover. I pulled out a single sheet of banking letterhead and slid it directly across the mahogany table to Terrence. That is the current verified balance of our joint domestic accounts, I announced. The exact accounts your lawyer just froze with your emergency injunction. The accounts you plan to use to fund your new life and your permanent alimony. Terrence picked up the paper. His arrogant smirk did not just fade, it completely disintegrated. The blood rushed out of his face so fast he looked physically ill. He stared at the bold printed numbers, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Calvin snatched the paper right out of his son's hands. $14.32, I read aloud, making sure the entire room heard the exact figure. I believe that covers the exact cost of the 2 iced lattes you and Kiara charged to my corporate card on your very first morning in the guest house. Keep the change. Where is the $8.5 million? Calvin roared, standing up and slamming his hands on the table. Where is the capital, Camille? The capital is currently resting comfortably in a highly secure corporate holding account in Zurich, Switzerland, I replied, offering Calvin a pristine, chilling smile. It was transferred as part of a legitimate, fully documented international business expansion for my firm. Untouchable by domestic divorce courts, completely insulated by Swiss privacy laws, and 100% mine. Before the shock could fully register, I pulled out the next set of documents. I turned my attention to the head of the table where the matriarch was suddenly looking very small. Brenda, I said cheerfully, pulling out a stack of stamped returned checks. I believe these belong to you. I tossed the stack across the table. They scattered in front of her emerald green suit. Those are the bounce checks from your country club and your megachurch, I explained, watching the horror dawn in her eyes. The automatic payments failed this morning. You see, the blind trust that has been secretly paying your credit card bills for the last 5 years was officially dissolved. The country club board has already voted to revoke your access. Your pastor called my office this afternoon asking why your generous $10,000 tithe was suddenly flagged for insufficient funds. You have been playing high society on my dime, Brenda, and the bank is officially closed. Brenda clutched her chest, her breathing shallow. Terrence, tell me she is lying! Brenda gasped, looking frantically at her son. Tell me you have the money. Tell me your agency is paying for this. I laughed, a loud, genuine, echoing laugh that filled the private dining room. I looked at Terrence, who was still staring blankly at the paper, showing his $14 net worth. Terrence, why do you not explain your massive sports agency to your mother? I suggested. Why do you not tell her about the European contracts? Terrence swallowed hard, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead. The European contracts are real, he stammered, his voice stripped of all its unearned masculine authority. The capital is staging. There is no European sports contract, I said, cutting him off with lethal precision. There never was. I made that up so you would tell your accountant to ignore the massive wire transfers I was sending to Switzerland. You have not signed a client in 2 years. Your agency is a financial graveyard, and you are currently drowning in $2 million of high-interest business debt. Debt that you just legally claimed full responsibility for when you handed me that divorce petition. The room descended into a state of absolute paralyzed shock. They were looking at me like I was a monster. They were looking at me like I had just burned their entire world to the ground. And they were absolutely right. I reached back into the red folder. The autopsy was not over. The execution had only just begun. I pulled out a bright pink carbon copy and held it up to the light, ready to sever the next lifeline. I held the bright pink carbon copy between my manicured fingers, letting the overhead chandelier illuminate the harsh official print. I slid it right down the polished wood until it tapped against Monique's crystal water glass. Monique, I said cheerfully, my voice slicing through her paralyzed shock. That is a formal repossession order from your luxury auto dealership. Since I revoked my corporate guarantor status on your vehicle exactly 30 days ago, your lease went into immediate default. The tow truck driver texted my assistant 10 minutes ago. He is currently hooking up your pristine white SUV in the restaurant parking lot right now. You might want to ask your brother for a ride home tonight." Monique shrieked. She jumped up from her chair so fast it tipped over, scrambling blindly toward the window to look out at the parking lot. I did not miss a single beat. I pulled out 2 certified bank notices and slid them across the table to Andre and Chelsea. "Please review those carefully. That is the notice of default on your sprawling eco-friendly sanctuary in Decatur. You see, the blind trust that has been auto-drafting your $7,500 mortgage every month was dissolved. You missed your first payment." Chelsea dropped her sparkling water. The glass shattered against her china plate, spraying water across the pristine tablecloth. Andre turned pale, his eyes darting frantically toward Terrence. "Oh, and Andre." I continued, leaning forward and lowering my voice to a lethal pitch. "Remember that $50,000 logistics loan you begged me for last month? The one you eagerly signed without reading the fine print in my kitchen? That was a corporate loan from Terrence's sports agency. Because Terrence's agency is completely insolvent, that loan triggered a cross-collateralization clause. The creditors now hold a direct lien on whatever equity you have left in that house. You legally tied your own throat to your brother's sinking ship." Terrence slammed his fists on the table. The veins in his neck were bulging. He was desperate to salvage whatever shred of masculine authority he thought he still possessed. "I do not care about any of that," Terrence roared, pointing a shaking finger at me. "Give me the deed to the house. You signed the divorce papers. I am keeping the Buckhead estate. Hand over the deed right now." I laughed. A loud, genuine echoing laugh that filled the private dining room and made Calvin flinch. "Terrence." "There is no deed for you to take," I said softly. "I purchased that entire property 5 years ago through a discreet offshore limited liability company registered in Geneva. I am the sole managing director and beneficiary. You cannot take a house you do not own. And speaking of the estate, I have one last document for you." I pulled out a formal legal notice stamped with a bright red seal. I slid it down the table until it touched Kiara's diamond tennis bracelet. "That is an immediate eviction notice," I announced. "It goes into full legal effect at midnight tonight. My private security team is currently boxing up your brand new Louis Vuitton suitcases and leaving them at the very end of the driveway. You have exactly 3 hours to vacate my property." Complete, absolute chaos erupted in the private dining room. The facade of their wealthy, united family shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Kiara shot up from her chair. She looked at Terrence with wide, terrified eyes. The illusion of her billionaire sports agent sugar daddy had just evaporated. "You are broke!" Kiara screamed at him, her voice cracking with pure hysteria. "You lied to me! You are a broke, pathetic fraud!" Terrence tried to grab her arm, his face desperate. "Baby, wait. Let me explain." "Do not touch me!" she yelled, slapping his hand away. She grabbed her designer bag, nearly tripping over her heels as she stormed toward the double doors. "I am not going down with a bankrupt loser." She threw the heavy wooden doors open and sprinted down the hallway, abandoning him without a second thought. The family completely turned on each other. Andre lunged at Terrence, grabbing him by the lapels of his suit. "You ruined us," Andre roared, shaking his younger brother. "You told me to sign that paper. You put a lien on my house." Chelsea was sobbing uncontrollably, her head buried in her hands, chanting about her ruined energy and her destroyed sanctuary. Brenda was hyperventilating into a linen napkin, praying aloud for a miracle that was never going to come. Calvin stood frozen in place. He was staring at the signed divorce petition on the table, realizing his master legal strategy had just secured his son a lifetime of unpayable debt, with absolutely zero marital assets to offset it. By signing that petition tonight, I pointed out over the screaming, "You just legally claimed all operational business accounts. You just legally bound yourself to $2 million of debt. Congratulations on your ethical transition, Terrence. You got exactly what you asked for." The private dining room doors swung open again. A waiter walked in, completely horrified by the screaming match happening in the corner. He nervously approached the head of the table, avoiding eye contact with everyone, and set down a black leather folder. "The bill," the waiter whispered, his voice trembling. $3,500. Terrence let go of his brother's shirt and stared at the black leather folder. The reality of his situation finally hit him. His black card was permanently declined. His accounts were holding $14. He was standing in a five-star restaurant with a massive bill he could not possibly pay. I stood up and smoothed the front of my emerald green Tom Ford dress. I picked up my designer clutch and buttoned my coat. The panic, the devastation, and the utter ruin of the people who had tried to destroy me felt like the warmest sunshine I had ever experienced. I looked down at Terrence, who was staring at the dinner bill with hollow, defeated eyes. The arrogant king had been reduced to a beggar in a matter of minutes. "You wanted an ethical transition," I said, my voice dripping with icy finality. "You got it. The bill is yours." I turned my back on the screaming, crying, devastated family and walked out of the private dining room. The heavy wooden doors swung shut behind me, cutting off the sounds of their spectacular implosion. I walked through the quiet elegance of the steakhouse, ignoring the stares of the other patrons. I stepped out into the cool Atlanta night. The humid air felt refreshing against my skin. A sleek black car was already waiting at the curb, the driver holding the back door open for me. "To the airport," I told the driver, settling back into the plush leather seats. As the car merged onto the highway, carrying me toward a first-class flight to Switzerland, I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the minibar. I had protected my peace. I had secured my empire. I had left the parasites to feed on each other in the wreckage of their own making. I closed my eyes and smiled. I was finally free. The most powerful lesson from this journey is that your worth should never be tied to people who only value what you provide. When you shrink yourself to protect someone else's fragile ego, you invite disrespect into your own home. True empowerment comes from recognizing your value and setting unbreakable boundaries. You do not have to scream or fight to win a battle against toxic people. Sometimes the ultimate victory is walking away in total silence, taking back your energy, and letting their own bad choices become their consequences. Never finance your own disrespect, and always remember that walking away with your dignity intact is the ultimate revenge. If you have ever had to reclaim your peace and power from toxic people, drop a comment sharing your story and hit that subscribe button for more empowering content.